Statement 1 says, for feminists, the question of how we read is inextricably linked with the question of what we read. 2 states, Elaine Showalter's critique of the literary curriculum is exemplary of this work. 3 states, androcentric literature structures the reading experience differently depending on the gender of the reader. 4 says, the documentation of this realization was one of the earliest tasks undertaken by feminist critics. 5 says, more specifically, the feminist inquiry into the activity of reading begins with the realization that the literary canon is androcentric and that this has a profoundly damaging effect on women readers. Now, this is a very confusing question because all statements seem to be connected here. So, for once, we'll have to resort to drawing connections. We don't usually unjumble the statements in an odd statement question, but here we'll have to. So, if we see, the most general statement is one, hence, one begins the passage here. For feminists, the question of how we read is inextricably linked with the question of what we read. This connects to statement 5, which says more specifically the feminist inquiry. How do we get this connection? The question for feminists, the question or the feminist inquiry into the activity of reading, how we read. So, this in essence refers to the same thing, with the realization that the literary canon is androcentric and that this has a profoundly damaging effect on women readers. So 1 and 5 are connected. We see here that this then connects with 4. That can be seen from the word realization. The documentation of this realization, and we have with the realization that the literary canon is androcentric given in 5. The documentation of this realization was one of the earliest tasks undertaken by feminist critics. So again, undertaken by feminist critics, feminist inquiry, for feminists, the questions, all of these, as we see then, are connected. So we can eliminate these 3 statements. We can eliminate statement 1, 4, and 5. These are not the odd statements. Now comes the problem, because these 2 statements are so generalized, we are not sure what any of these connects with. Let's check 2 first. Elaine Showalter's critique of the literary curriculum is exemplary of this work. We can still find that this statement connects because first it says this work. This work might connect with androcentric literature, but that makes less sense than it connecting with the documentation or the question that is being analyzed. So, more specifically, the feminist inquiry into the activity of reading and such. Exemplary of this work is the documentation of this realization was one of the earliest tasks. So, tasks and work can finally be connected. So, we find that 2 then connects with at least 2 of the other statements. And these 2 statements, 4 and 5, they form a premise connection with 1. That suggests that 3 is the odd statement. Now, the one thing that throws us off is androcentric literature. We do have the mention of androcentric in 5, but we'll see that that's actually a distraction. Another thing that confuses us, we could say, is that 3 and 1 seem to be connected, but actually they are not. 3 says androcentric literature structures the reading experience differently depending on the gender of the reader. Here we get the final aspect, the final reason why this is the odd statement, because here the gender sense has been completely effaced, and this statement says the reading experience differently depends on the gender of the reader. So it's not specific to men or women, it's rather whoever reads it, a man or a woman, would analyze and understand it differently. But that said, we now see that all of the other statements, they either speak about the women's perspective or the feminist perspective. We have this aspect in one for feminists, in four for feminist critics, in five feminist inquiry, damaging effect on women readers, and finally, in two, we have Elaine Showalter's critique of the literary curriculum. Critique of the literary curriculum that connects with the question of what we read, how we read, earlier stars taken by feminist critics, and then the activity of reading begins with. So finally, we see that 2 also connects with the premise, while 3, although very close, has some difference with the premise, some factor which differentiates it. So 3 can be qualified. Finally, we get the answer as 3.